Happy 2025, folks. We are getting right back into it. So, we're going to look at Black Myth Wukong, one of the best looking games, considered the benchmark for what is currently the visual quality benchmark for video games. Why does it have that? Why does it look that way? Why is it being received so well, other than it being friggin' awesome? From an art standpoint, what can we learn from the artists from Game Science that have posted some of their work recently? And we got some really juicy stuff. We got some breakdowns. We got some full renders. There's a few things I want to draw attention to that I think is really interesting as a game developer as well. And we'll get into it. So I've linked, I've got the references for all these folks as we scroll down them. And first and foremost, let's change to the corner. First and foremost, I'd like to thank folks on the Patreon. Pretty much launched now. You get Discord access and Patreon only videos if you are a channel member. All that sort of stuff. Check out the description below. But thank you again, folks, for supporting. So let us get into what it is. So Black Myth Wukong. Each image I want to draw attention to something that I think is helping make this stand out, but also that I find very interesting as well. So one of the main things that I've noticed in Black Myth Wukong is that there is an active effort in making the shadows not pitch black. And what's great about this is just a good trick in general, but if you put black bars on your work in progress work, not just for your final renders, but for your WIPs in a production scenario, the black bar is almost like a measurement. Because if you look at this black bar where they have their branding and all that sort of stuff, and then you just take this mouse up here where I'm going to, actually, let's get the annotation. We go from the black bar to our first area of where it is darkest. That is not pitch black. That's actually kind of like brown. It's like slightly tinted brown and it's lifted up. One of the main ways you can lift your shadows up, there's a lot of ways to tackle really dark shadows in Unreal. Now, believe me, Unreal really crushes the contrast right out of the package. That's why you get that Unreal look to a lot of things. So there are a lot of ways you can fight against Unreal crushing the shadows. One way that will get you this type of look, this sort of washed out, color graded brown look, is actually to go into the post-process of Unreal and go to the offset in the shadows and just bring that offset up a little bit. If you bring it up dramatically, you'll see it affect everything. But if you bring that offset up just very, very slightly, you'll see that you're going to mitigate against those shadows. So yeah, there is this sort of washout in the shadows in a lot of these main beauty shots, which I think is awesome because you can see the detail. If this was complete black, you wouldn't see the detail in these areas, which is important in both SDR mainly. In HDR, yeah, you probably see it, but most people are on SDR, LDR, whatever you want to label it as. They're not in high dynamic range. They don't have the monitors for it. So seeing that detail is going to be important. And it's a photography principle as well. If you bring up the shadows, you'll see more detail. If you clip your shadows and you clip your highlights, you can't get that detail back as well. So that's the first thing from a lighting perspective. And you're going to see that in a lot of these shots as we scroll down. Same with this one, right? After a certain distance, you can see here that the fog is actually feeding into the shadows of the scene, because if we take a look at our closest framing element, which is here, you'll notice that this is still not going straight to black. If we had the black borders on this image as well, that would help as a measurement, but yeah, this is not complete black, but it's a lot darker than the dark side of this sort of tower. And the reason is one of the other ways that dark values get addressed in lighting is by the fog. Now, it is very common in a lot of Unreal projects or personal projects where you set the height fog or the volumetric fog, and you don't set a distance to it. The fog is right in your face. Now, when you have fog, it deflates value. So it makes darkers lighter and vice versa. So if you have fog everywhere in front of the screen with no distance, what's going to happen is you're going to wash out the image. But if you have a start distance on the fog, and all fog settings on Unreal, you can set a start distance. Have the fog start deeper into the image, and then you're going to get this sort of nice, sort of brownish grey. Well, it's going to be grey ultimately until you color grade it in your shadows. But even then, up close, you use the tricks like the offset trick, or change the tone mapper to get those darker values just slightly above black as well. So that's what we can see here. We can see these darker values towards the camera aren't as light as here because the fog is being offset later on in the image. But even when we don't have the fog being offset, we're not complete black in these values. So you can actually see a little bit. It'll probably be hard to see on the YouTube video. You can still actually see little bits of detail in there. And that's because they are making an active effort to bring up the minimum value of going to black, which is, again, going to lose you a lot of detail. Let's go down to the next one. Another reason why the game looks so good is simply because the assets just have the highest level of care and artistry imaginable. Now, it's S tier, SSS tier, S plus tier. The highest tier of art production you can get is what you're going to get in a game like Wukong. You can see the level of sculpting that goes into these assets. If we just zoom in here. And they're actually putting in a lot of noise into the assets as well, which is important because often people will say, don't put lots of noise into the sculpt, which is true. If you put lots of really, 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 really fine noise into the sculpt, you're going to lose it. And even to a degree, the sculpts on these assets we're seeing, they're going to lose a little bit of their sharpness in the bake. But when you have a overall level of noise, you're just helping yourself in the texturing phase. So this level of noise is right on, like, for example, these areas here, like, yeah, it gets a bit noisy. That's going to blur out in the bake, depending on how they're doing the bake. But this sort of general level of noise that we see in this selection here, this is fine because then it's not super and hyper noisy. It's just a little bit of noise that's helping. And you can do this type of noise procedurally. So do like manual sculpting of edges with your trim dynamic. Yeah, sure. But when you come to do surface noise, a lot of the time using alphas based off photogrammetry or based off really good height maps is the way. You don't want to go in and sculpt every tiny bit of noise. It's going to take forever. So use your manual sculpting of edges, your manual sculpting of these big chunks. But then when it gets to all this like tiny little bits of grain, use Noisemaker, use a drag rect alpha, and let the alphas help you. It's the number one way, right? You know, you buy a tutorial from like a God of War artist. There's loads out there, right? They are using alphas with manual sculpting and then sculpting back into the alphas because it's smart and it's efficient. Sculpting all the noise bit by bit, you're going to be there for months. But yeah, when every asset goes through a pipeline like this, where the artist is not only making incredibly complex forms, but actually sculpting in medium noise with the alphas and Noisemaker and the manual sculpting, every asset is going to be like the best it can be. Like, this is the highest form of sculpting you can get with this sort of stuff as well. But yeah, it's just, look at it, it's just beautiful. Yeah, you can probably tell that these cracks are, again, from an alpha. Let's say using alphas would just help you so much with a combination of your manual sculpting and alpha masking. But what's interesting is, with environment art sculpts, usually, because you're not deforming too much, like this one obviously has a lot of deformation, but there is a certain point in a lot of these sculpts where you're done making the large forms and you're just doing surface wear. Now, when you get to that stage, when you've done your final few dynameshes and you're happy with the medium forms and you're just dragging on alphas, you can actually just go ahead and use a layer in ZBrush and tie your surface noise onto that layer, because you're not changing the sculpt dramatically to the point where you need to redynamesh. And that can be quite strong, having your sculpt at the end with a noise layer with the alphas on a separate layer that you can control in and out with the intensity slider. It keeps you non-destructive as well. ZBrush is very destructive, but you can retain a little bit of non-destructiveness with environment assets that aren't going to change too much after their initial form. But yes, with your environment stuff, you can actually use layers, and you can be non-destructive with your sculpts if you work in a smart way. Because at the end of the day, we're chipping edges and all that sort of stuff. So, but yeah, another thing I noticed is they use SpeedTree after they've sculpted their trees. So SpeedTree, again, just great software to... You're not going to place trees, you're not going to do the hierarchy of a tree and the branches and the fronds and all that stuff better than SpeedTree. Just not going to happen. But if you leverage SpeedTree, if you use SpeedTree in conjunction with hand editing controls with a custom based branch that you've done, you're going to be good to go. So you'll notice that there's a lot of SpeedTree images here where they're using SpeedTree's advantages to get natural layouts in the trees, obviously with their own hand editing. But what's very interesting is, skip this one, come back to it. They're using it with sculpted bases. This type of sculpting on trees, oh man, it's just incredible. It's so difficult to do as well because you just got to have such a good eye for sculpting organic forms. And you can see here we've got like these placeholder branches of where you do a strong sculpt for the bottom, but as you move up the tree and you start to lose texture density of what your unique sculpt's going to be, you can go a bit easier on the noise. And then when you get to these sort of branches here, that's where you're going to let SpeedTree take over to do the placement of the higher level branches to get the overall canopy in the front there. Any foliage artist watching me is probably going to say, you're saying the terminology wrong. I probably am. I'm not a foliage artist. Yeah, really nice, big, soft forms. You can see here with this sculpt, it's interesting how all the artists have their own style, because this sculpt does adhere to more of the traditional workflow of there's not a lot of noise here. It's very medium detail. They're probably using detail maps afterwards as well. But in that sculpt earlier, we saw they're actually dragging on a lot of noise. So it's very interesting to see the workflows between each artist. And yeah, you can work however you want as long as it ends up in the main art direction. Yeah, this will bake down pretty nice. I assume they're going to mix this with photogrammetry base. This looks like a photogrammetry texture painted, maybe poly painted into it with some vertex blends and probably some other magic trickery. Silhouettes, again, you can see that SpeedTree taking over for the end layout with the custom base. And the silhouette for trees is important. So you'll notice that most of the detail of the silhouette and the noise is usually on the outer parts of the tree. And then in the middle, you actually leave a lot of these little holes so that you can see through and have the light come through and have the silhouette read better. So usually I find that a lot of these trees have a lot of the density and set dressing of the branches towards the end, and in the middle they don't have too many branches and leaves because it makes everything a bit messy and unreadable from a distance. But yeah, this is just high level stuff. It's funny, right? You can see where they're just chilling on these bits because they'll let the SpeedTree take over. Yeah, just beautiful stuff. This looks pretty much, oh my god, look at the size. See, this is another reason. We spoke about this in the Assassin's Creed video, but when your character is that high and your asset is this high, you can't really put noise in the sculpt because it's going to be so blurry. So what will happen is, like we spoke like with the gate, right? Or with an asset that is a rock or anything like that, when we spoke with Nate Stevens about this back in the God of War talk. What happens with an asset like this is you have usually, here's my drawing skills, artist by the way. Oh, the squares aren't even equal, it's pain. So what you usually have is, you have 2 UV sets. So this tree in its sculpted unique form with the medium level sculpt is essentially a unique unwrap. Now you have to remember, texture density is very important. And we spoke about before how most games will use a 1024 per 1 meter of space. I think this character is like 1.8 meters, right? So there ain't no way you're fitting this tree on a 1K, a 2K, 4096, two 4096s. There's no way you're going to do it for the main texture that's going to go on it. However, what you can do is, and it's very common with large objects, you put a sculpt that isn't too noisy, aka this tree, and you put that as a unique unwrap, because it's unique detail at the end of the day that's being sculpted. You put that onto a UV1 and you unwrap it like a hero asset. And you give that, I don't know, let's say you give that a 2048 by 2048. You give it the best starting base so that it isn't too blurry. Because even with a sculpt that is medium form, it's going to get pretty blurry at some point. Let's try this. Yeah, so it's going to become blurry no matter what, right? That's why this sculpt is not so noisy, because we can't support that in UV1 or UV0 if you start in Unreal, because programmers start from 0. So what happens is you have your bake here. So you do a 0 to 1 bake, and you bake this to a lower poly version of itself with unique UVs, typical hero asset. And what you can do afterwards is you have a second UV set. And the second UV set is the it can be a second unwrap, it really depends, but your second UV is your tileable textures. So tileable textures that help make up the asset. So what you do is you combine the UV1, which is the big medium forms, and the UV2, which is the tileable texture and the noise and the high details scaled up and up and up, to give it its sharpness. And then you use a bunch of other shader trickery, like you can use, for example, a third UV set, or you can do a gradient on the asset with shader tech. On a core level, the recipe of having a unique baked UV1 and a tileable UV2 is how you approach really large assets in a lot of cases, because it's impossible to do it otherwise, right? So you see that with rocks a lot, but the same can be true with trees as well. So yeah, if you look at this tree, it looks to me like you've got, my best guess is you've got one type of sort of tileable here, and then a vertex blend of like another type of bark, and then they're probably using an AO map from the unique bake to very slightly tint. You can use RGB masks and everything, right, to slowly tint stuff as well. Yeah, you can see it here. There's a vertex blend right here where it transitions into the other bark. Yeah, you can see it around here. That's essentially how to do it, right? Because it's a very large asset. And that's why the sculpt isn't as noisy as it is. Maybe this one gives it away better. Yeah, look, maybe there's 2 to 3 blends going on here. It looks like maybe 2 tileable texture blends, maybe some decals as well, but on the core of it, there's probably 2 blends there. And then this is great as well, because you see just the amount of foliage going into the game with the character for scale. Very nicely presented, kind of scaling up all the way until you reach the top. And yeah, like I say, the key benefit of having a few different bark textures that are tileable is that you can just use them in so many places, on small trees, large trees, and they're not bound by texture density, because you can scale them however you want to meet the texture density. And then when you get really big objects, yeah, you do your big unique sculpt, but you use those tileables with the sculpt to make it look like a unique asset. The grass and these bases are good. Like these pieces of bark here would probably use one of the tileables that is used on this tree. But with these little pieces of bark, they don't need to be sculpted because they're so small. So they're just basically polygon modeled, and then probably big planes of alpha maps, or with a higher scalability, they're probably using nanite as well. But I think the key message we can see of why this game looks the way it does is on lighting, they're doing as much as they can to reveal detail in the shadows and in the light by making sure they don't crush the shadows in that sort of tone map or with the offset. Every asset is getting a sculpt pass, and with the very large assets, they're working very clever. They're using tilables with unique unwraps, using multiple UV sets or multiple texture blends in their game engine to essentially sell these large objects that they can use over and over from their other assets. Combine that with really fun gameplay and a respectable time to develop the game. I remember hearing about this game years ago, that boss fight with the beast on the roof, years and years ago, and they've developed a great game from it. But yeah, those are some of the key elements. Very high level environment art, very inspiring stuff. I'll link the profiles in the comments below, but hopefully that helps of why this game looks the way it does, and hopefully you can, there's a few ideas there to go and learn from and explore in more detail. But yeah, beautiful stuff. Great to see these game dev techniques in such a modern game as well. For now, peace.